She scrubbed the same countertop for the third time, not because it was dirty, but because her hands needed something to do besides shake. 3 years of smiling through a woman's contempt will hollow you out in places you didn't know existed. Marlene Hayes learned that the hard way, learned it at dinner tables where the crystal cost more than her childhood home. But the thing about people who survive quietly, they're building something nobody sees coming. Stay with me until the end. Drop a like. And tell me, comment your city. Where are you watching from tonight? The kitchen still smelled like roasted garlic and something expensive Marlene couldn't name when Vivian Caldwell's voice cut through the dining room wall like a blade through wet paper. Not loud. Vivian was never loud. She didn't need to be. The woman had spent 6 decades learning how to destroy a person at conversational volume, and she'd perfected it the way some people perfect a golf swing, through relentless, joyless repetition. Marlene stood at the sink with both hands wrapped around a wine glass she'd already washed twice. The water ran cold over her knuckles. She could hear every word through the archway, and she knew, the way a dog knows thunder is coming before the sky changes, that tonight was going to be worse than usual. I told Catherine last week, Vivian was saying to someone at the table. I said, Catherine, you should see how she dresses for these dinners. Like she's attending a church potluck in some forgotten county. I genuinely worry she's doing it on purpose to embarrass us. A chair scraped. Ethan's voice, low and careful. Mom, come on. Come on what, darling? I'm making an observation. Your father never would have tolerated someone so, what's the word I'm looking for, so aggressively plain in this family. Marlene set the glass down on the counter. She pressed her fingertips against the granite until the nails went white. There was a specific quality to humiliation that most people misunderstood. They thought it burned. It didn't. It froze. It turned your blood into something slow and thick that couldn't reach the parts of you that needed to fight back. 3 years of this, and Marlene had become an expert at standing perfectly still while someone peeled her skin off in public. She dried her hands on a towel that probably cost $40 and walked back into the dining room. 8 faces around a table built for 12. Vivian at the head, because Vivian was always at the head, even when the chair technically belonged to someone else. Her silver hair pulled back so tight, it seemed to stretch the authority across her face. Diamond earrings catching the chandelier light like small, expensive threats. Ethan sat 2 seats down, his jaw working the way it always worked when he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the version of words that would satisfy everyone in the room simultaneously. Marlene took her chair. She smiled. She always smiled. Not because she was weak, but because she'd learned young that the alternative, letting them see you crumble, fed something in people like Vivian that never got full. The lamb was wonderful, Vivian, Marlene said. Her voice came out steady, steadier than she felt. Vivian turned her gaze on Marlene the way a lighthouse beam sweeps across dark water, impersonal, mechanical, and devastating to whatever it touches. I'm sure it was a step up from whatever you grew up eating, dear. Ethan's sister Caroline coughed into her napkin. Across the table, Vivian's younger brother Gerald studied his wine with the intensity of a man who'd witnessed this particular show too many times to pretend it was new. My mother made excellent pot roast, Marlene said. I'm sure she did. Vivian picked up her fork. With coupons. The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people digesting a meal. The airless quiet of witnesses who knew they were watching something ugly and had collectively decided their comfort was worth more than intervention. Marlene felt the heat climb her neck. Not embarrassment anymore. Something else. Something that had been growing for months in a space between her ribs where patience used to live. She looked at Ethan. He was staring at his plate. He was always staring at his plate. She had married him 4 years ago in a ceremony that Vivian had tried to derail 3 separate times. Once, by threatening to cut Ethan's trust fund. Once by hiring a private investigator to find dirt on Marlene's family. And once by simply not showing up until the reception was halfway over. Ethan had called each incident "mom being mom," as though the woman's cruelty was a weather pattern rather than a choice. And Marlene had accepted it. That was the part that kept her awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom in Ethan's townhouse. The accepting. She'd built her whole identity around resilience, around the idea that if you were kind enough and patient enough and good enough, the world would eventually return the favor. 31 years old, and she was still waiting for the world to hold up its end. "Ethan," Vivian said, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, "have you given any more thought to what we discussed?" Ethan shifted. "This isn't the time." "There's never a time, according to you, which is precisely the problem." "What did you discuss?" Marlene asked. The table got quieter, which Marlene wouldn't have thought possible. Vivian's eyes moved to Marlene with something that might have been amusement in a person capable of actual joy. "Family business, dear." "I'm family." "Are you?" It wasn't a question. Vivian said it the way someone might identify a stain on a tablecloth, with recognition but no acceptance. Ethan pushed back from the table. "Mom, enough! Marlene, can we talk in the kitchen for a minute?" "No," Marlene said. She surprised herself. The word came out clean and whole. Without the usual packaging of politeness, she wrapped everything in when Caldwells were present. "Whatever it is, say it here." Vivian set her fork down. She looked at her son with an expression that managed to be both disappointed and triumphant, like a chess player who'd predicted an opponent's mistake and was sad it arrived so quickly. "I suggested," Vivian said, turning each word over before releasing it, "that Ethan might be happier with someone who understands the responsibilities of this family. Someone from a comparable background. Someone who can hold a room, attend a benefit, and not look like she wandered in from the help's entrance." The silence after that sentence had weight to it. Marlene could feel it on her chest. She looked around the table, at Caroline, who was examining her cuticles with surgical focus, at Gerald, who'd found something fascinating at the bottom of his glass, at Ethan's cousin Marcus, who had pulled out his phone under the table. 8 people. Not one of them willing to look at her. Ethan stood up. "We're leaving." "Sit down, Ethan." Vivian's voice didn't rise, it lowered. That was worse. "Sit down and have an adult conversation for once in your life." Ethan sat down. Marlene watched him do it. She watched the way his shoulders dropped, the way his hands went flat on the table, like a student called to the principal's office. She'd seen it 100 times. The physical vocabulary of a man who'd been trained since birth to mistake obedience for respect. He loved her. She believed that completely. But love without courage was just a feeling that happened to someone while they watched you drown. "I think," Marlene said, and every face at the table turned toward her, "that I've heard enough for tonight." She stood. She didn't rush. She didn't knock anything over or make a scene. She picked up her purse from the sideboard, put on her coat, the same navy coat Vivian had once described as department store chic, and walked toward the front door. Ethan caught her in the hallway, his hand on her elbow, gentle, almost pleading. "Marlene, please, she doesn't mean it." "She means every word, Ethan. That's the one thing your mother and I agree on. She means exactly what she says." "I'll talk to her." "You've been saying that for 3 years." I know I have, but this time what?" She turned to face him. Under the hallway light, she could see the faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they got married. He was 34 and looked 40. Carrying Vivian's expectations did that to people, so it aged them from the inside like rot in a beam that still looked solid until you leaned on it. Long. "This time you'll actually say something? You'll actually stand between me and that woman and tell her that her behavior is cruel?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's what I thought," Marlene said. She drove home in the rain, not crying. Past crying. She was in that territory beyond tears where the body just goes numb and the mind runs calculations it's been avoiding. How much longer could she sustain this? How many more dinners, holidays, birthday galas, Easter brunches, charity functions? How many more times could she smile through Vivian's contempt and walk out with her spine intact? The thing about endurance, and Marlene had thought about this more than any person should have to, was that people celebrated it like a virtue, when really it was just a description of suffering that hadn't killed you yet. Enduring wasn't the same as living. Enduring was what you did when you couldn't figure out how to stop being in pain. She pulled into the driveway of the townhouse, sat in the car with the engine running and the wipers going back and forth, while the rain came down hard enough to blur the porch light into a smear of yellow. Her phone buzzed. Ethan. She didn't look at it. Inside the house was dark and clean. She dropped her purse on the counter, kicked off her shoes, and stood in the kitchen in her stockinged feet, staring at the refrigerator like it might have answers. Her phone buzzed again. Then again. 3 texts in a row. She turned the phone face down on the counter and poured herself a glass of water. The next morning was Saturday. Marlene drove to the Greenfield Community Library at 7:30, an hour before it opened, because the quiet of an empty building was the only kind of silence that didn't feel like defeat. She unlocked the side door, turned on the lights in the children's section first, always the children's section first, because the fluorescent hum over those tiny chairs and bright-spined picture books was the closest thing she had to proof that the world could still be kind. She was shelving returns when Janet, the senior librarian, came in at 8:15 with 2 coffees and a look that said she'd already heard. Caroline called Marcus's wife, who called Diane at the salon, Janet said, setting a cup on the cart. Small town grapevine. You know how it goes. Fantastic. You okay? Marlene slotted a book into its place. Define okay. Janet leaned against the shelf. She was 62, divorced twice, had raised 3 kids on a librarian's salary, and possessed the specific kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving things that were supposed to destroy you. I define it as still standing and still capable of sarcasm. Then I'm okay. Ethan call? 12 times. You answer? Not yet. Janet nodded slowly. You know what I learned from my second marriage? Actually, from both marriages? Love doesn't fix cowardice. You can love someone down to the marrow and still watch them fail you every single time it matters. Marlene stopped shelving. She stood there with a copy of a young adult novel in her hand and felt something crack behind her sternum. Not dramatically, not the way things broke in movies, but slowly, the way ice splits on a pond when the temperature shifts just enough. I keep thinking it'll change, Marlene said. I know you do, honey. But is that stupid? It's human, which is worse. Marlene laughed. It came out small and tired, but it was real, and Janet squeezed her arm once, firmly, the way a person does when words aren't sufficient and they know it. The library opened at 9. Saturdays were always busy. Story time at 10, homework help at noon, a steady stream of retirees and young mothers and teenagers who came for the Wi-Fi and stayed for the air conditioning. Marlene moved through it all with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for 7 years and still found meaning in every interaction. She helped a 12-year-old find a book about space. She talked a nervous father through the process of getting his first library card. She fixed the printer twice and unjammed the copy machine once and cleaned up a juice spill in the children's corner without being asked. Nobody at the library knew she was married to a Caldwell. She'd kept her maiden name, and Ethan's world, the charity boards, the country club, the business dinners, existed in a different orbit entirely. Here, she was just Marlene, the librarian who remembered every regular's name and what they were reading last. There was a version of her that lived only in this building, competent, valued, sufficient. The version that existed in the Caldwell dining room was something else entirely. Smaller, quieter, a woman whose edges had been sanded down by 3 years of being told she didn't belong. She was locking up at 6 when Ethan's car appeared in the parking lot. He got out. He was wearing the charcoal coat she'd bought him for their second anniversary. His hair was damp from the rain that had been coming and going all day, and he stood by his car with his hands in his pockets like a teenager who'd shown up to apologize but hadn't rehearsed the words. You didn't answer your phone, he said. I was working. Marlene. I was working, Ethan. He crossed the parking lot. Up close, she could see the dark circles under his eyes and the way his jaw kept tightening and releasing, like a valve trying to manage pressure that had no outlet. I'm sorry about last night. What she said was out of line. Out of line, Marlene repeated it like she was tasting something bitter. Your mother told an entire table of people that you should leave me for someone richer, and you're calling it out of line, like she used the wrong fork. That's not fair. What's not fair is sitting at that table and watching you fold every single time she opens her mouth. What's not fair is spending 3 years proving myself to a woman who decided I was garbage the day she met me, and the one person who's supposed to have my back just sits there studying his lamb. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. The rain was picking up again, dotting his shoulders, beating on the car behind him. I know I've let things slide. But she's my mother, Marlene. She's difficult, but she's cruel. Say it. Say it. He looked at her. She saw the war in his face, the desperate desire to protect both the women in his life simultaneously, which meant protecting neither of them, which meant failing the one who needed it while shielding the one who didn't deserve it. She can be cruel, he said finally. Each word came out like it cost him something. Can be? She told me I looked like the help, Ethan. She hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my dead mother's finances before our wedding. She spent Thanksgiving telling your aunt that I probably trapped you with a pregnancy scare. Can be cruel? She's a machine. I'll talk to her. Stop saying that. What do you want me to do? And there it was, the question that sat at the center of everything. Not what should he do? That was obvious. What did she want him to do, as though her expectations were the variable, as though the problem was her standards rather than his silence? I want you to be the man I married, Marlene said, the one who told me at our rehearsal dinner that he'd stand between me and anything that tried to hurt me. Remember that? Remember standing in that garden and saying those words? I remember. Then do it, or stop pretending you meant it. She got in her car. He stood in the rain and watched her drive away, and in her rearview mirror he looked exactly like what he was. A decent man trapped inside a coward's habits, wanting to be better, but not enough to actually move. Marlene drove. Not home. She drove past the turnoff for the townhouse and kept going, out past the edge of town where the road narrowed and the trees pressed in close on both sides, and the streetlights gave way to darkness. She didn't have a destination. She just needed to be somewhere that wasn't shaped by Caldwell expectations or Ethan's apologies, or the specific silence of a house that felt emptier the more people it was supposed to hold. The rain got heavier. The road got darker. 10 miles out, on a stretch of 2-lane blacktop that wound through old farmland, she saw it. A silver sedan pulled over on the shoulder with its hazards blinking weak and orange through the downpour. The hood was up. A figure stood beside it, hunched against the rain, one hand raised as her headlights swept across him. Every instinct she'd been taught said, keep driving. Dark road, unknown man, nobody around for miles. But something else. Something older than instinct, something wired into the part of her that had spent 7 years helping strangers find what they were looking for, made her slow down. She pulled over, rolled down the window. The rain blew in immediately, cold and sharp on her face. You need help? She called out. The man approached. He was older, 70s maybe, though he stood straight and moved with a deliberateness that suggested he'd once been formidable. Silver hair plastered to his skull, expensive coat soaked through, shoes that didn't belong on a country road. Engine cut out about 20 minutes ago, he said. His voice was calm. Not panicked, not aggressive. The voice of a man accustomed to problems and equally accustomed to them being solved. I've been trying to get a signal, but there's nothing out here. There won't be. Dead zone for about 4 miles in either direction. Get in, I'll drive you to the gas station up on Route 9. He hesitated. People with expensive coats always hesitated when offered something free, like they suspected the cost was just hidden. I'm not going to rob you, Marlene said. I'm a librarian. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. He walked around and got into the passenger seat, bringing the smell of rain and leather and something faintly metallic, motor oil maybe, from trying to look under the hood himself. Leonard, he said, extending a hand. Marlene. She shook it. His grip was firm, warmer than she expected for a man who'd been standing in a storm for 20 minutes. She pulled back onto the road. The wipers fought the rain. Neither of them spoke for a minute, which Marlene appreciated. She'd had enough words for one day, and something about this man's silence felt different from the silences she was used to. It wasn't the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of someone who understood that not every moment needed to be filled. Long way from anywhere, Leonard said eventually. I was driving to think. Dangerous habit in weather like this. Safer than the alternative. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the road, but she felt the look. Measuring, not intrusive. The gaze of a man who'd spent his life evaluating people and had gotten very good at it. You seem like you've had a rough night, he said. I've had a rough 3 years. That's a long time to be rough. Yes, it is. They drove in silence for another 2 miles. The rain eased slightly. Marlene could feel the tension in her shoulders beginning to loosen. Not because anything had been resolved, but because there was something profoundly restful about being in a car with a stranger who didn't know her, didn't know Ethan, had never heard of the Caldwells, and therefore required nothing from her except the basic human act of driving someone to safety. What do you do, Leonard? I'm retired. Mostly. Mostly retired means not retired. It means I'm old enough to quit but too stubborn to stop. What were you doing out here? Visiting property I own a few miles back. Haven't been out in years. Should have checked the car before I drove it. She glanced at him. The coat was cashmere, she realized now. The shoes, despite the mud, were hand-stitched. His watch. She couldn't see the brand in the dark, but it caught the dashboard light in a way that suggested it cost more than her annual salary. You own property out here? A few parcels. My late wife loved the countryside. I bought them decades ago to make her happy. Never could bring myself to sell them after she passed. I'm sorry about your wife. Thank you. It's been 12 years now. The grief changes shape, but it never leaves the room. Marlene said nothing. She understood that sentence the way you understand a language you didn't know you spoke, instinctively, in the bones. The gas station appeared up ahead, a bright square of fluorescence against the dark. Marlene pulled in. Leonard looked at her as though he was trying to solve a problem he hadn't expected to encounter. I appreciate this, he said. More than you know. Most people would have driven right past. Most people have somewhere to be. And you didn't? Not tonight. He studied her for another moment. You're a kind person, Marlene. I've been alive long enough to know that's rarer than people pretend. Kindness isn't rare. People just stopped rewarding it. Something moved across his face. Recognition, maybe? Or surprise. Or the look a person gets when they hear something they've been thinking for a long time said out loud by a stranger. Can I at least buy you a coffee? There's a diner across the road. Marlene looked at the clock. 9:45. She thought about the empty townhouse. Ethan's inevitable apology texts. The silence of rooms that didn't feel like home anymore. Sure, she said. I could use a coffee. They sat in a booth at the diner, the kind of place that hadn't changed its menu or its decor since the 70s, with cracked vinyl seats and a counter where a waitress named Bev poured coffee without asking if you wanted it. Leonard ordered black. Marlene added cream and 2 sugars and didn't care if that told him anything about her. You said you're a librarian, Leonard said. 7 years at Greenfield Community. You enjoy it? I love it. It's the only place I feel like myself. He tilted his head. That's a very specific thing to say. It's a very specific feeling. What about the rest of your life? You don't feel like yourself there. Marlene wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The warmth seeped into her palms. She didn't owe this man anything. Not her story, not her pain, not the truth about the slow erosion happening in her marriage. But there was something about Leonard that invited honesty. Maybe it was his age. Maybe it was the directness of his eyes, which were sharp and dark, and held the particular steadiness of someone who'd heard worse than whatever she could tell him. I married into a family that doesn't think I belong, she said, and the person who's supposed to convince them otherwise can't seem to find the words. Leonard nodded. He didn't rush to sympathize or offer advice. He just sat with the information the way a person sits with a heavy coat, acknowledging the weight without complaining about it. How long have you been carrying that? He asked. 3 years. Since the engagement, actually. His mother made her position clear from the beginning. And your husband? He loves me. I believe that. But love without action is just a word people say so they don't have to do anything difficult. Leonard looked at her. Something flickered behind his expression, deeper than sympathy, closer to recognition, like her words had unlocked a door he hadn't intended to open. I lost someone a long time ago, he said quietly. Someone I should have fought harder to keep. A wife? Before her. Someone from before my life became what it became. The way he said it carried more weight than the words themselves. Marlene didn't press. She understood that some stories have rooms you don't enter until you're invited. I looked for her, Leonard continued, for years, but the world is very good at swallowing people whole, and by the time I had the resources to search properly, the trail had gone cold. I'm sorry. Don't be. Regret's a better teacher than success. It doesn't let you forget the lesson. They talked for another hour. About books. Leonard read voraciously, mostly history and biography, and was surprised and pleased that Marlene could match him title for title. About the town, which Marlene knew in the intimate way that only librarians and mail carriers know a place. About nothing consequential and everything that mattered, in that way two strangers sometimes manage when neither has anything to prove. At 11, Marlene drove Leonard back to his car. A tow truck he'd finally managed to call from the diner was already there, loading the silver sedan onto its flatbed. Thank you, Marlene. Leonard stood in the gravel beside her car. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing in patches, showing stars. For the ride, for the company, for stopping when you didn't have to. It wasn't a big deal. It was to me. He reached into his coat and produced a card. Plain white, heavy stock, just a name and a phone number. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything. She took the card. Leonard Sterling. No title, no company, just the name. Good night, Leonard. Good night, Marlene. She drove home. The townhouse was lit from inside, Ethan's car in the drive, the living room lamp burning amber through the window. She sat in the car for a moment, Leonard's card in her palm. She tucked it into her purse. Inside, Ethan was on the couch. He stood when she came in. His face carried the expression of a man who'd been rehearsing an apology for hours and still wasn't sure he had it right. Where were you? He asked. Not angry, scared. Driving. Marlene, I know. We'll talk tomorrow, Ethan. I'm tired. She walked past him, up the stairs, into the bedroom. She closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the house settle around her. Below, she heard Ethan moving. The kitchen faucet, a cabinet opening and closing, his footsteps pausing at the bottom of the stairs and then retreating. Her phone buzzed. Not Ethan this time. An unknown number. The message read, I realized driving home that I never asked what books you'd recommend for someone trying to understand the concept of second chances. Good night, Marlene. L. She stared at the screen. In 3 years of marriage, surrounded by Caldwell money and Caldwell expectations and the crushing machinery of Caldwell approval, no one, not one person in that gilded, suffocating world had ever asked for her recommendation on anything. A stranger on a dark road in the rain had done in one evening what her husband's entire family hadn't managed in 3 years. He'd treated her like she mattered. She put the phone down, lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling. Downstairs, her purse sat on the counter with a white card inside it. Leonard Sterling. No title, no company, no indication whatsoever that the man she'd driven to a gas station in a rainstorm controlled enough wealth to buy the town she lived in, the library she worked in, and the Caldwell family name 3 times over. Or that the search he'd mentioned, the one that went cold, the someone he'd lost and never stopped looking for, had everything to do with the woman lying in the dark above him, wondering if kindness would ever be enough. Orchestrated cinematic screenplay with dialogue-heavy narrative and philosophical subtext. Orchestrated cinematic screenplay with dialogue-heavy narrative and philosophical subtext. She didn't sleep. Not really. The kind of half-consciousness where your body shuts down, but your mind keeps running laps around the same track. Leonard's text glowing on the screen, Ethan's footsteps retreating from the stairs, Vivian's voice slicing through a dining room like something surgical. Marlene lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe and thought about what it meant that a stranger's single question had made her feel more seen than 3 years of marriage to a man who claimed to love her. At 6 in the morning, she got up, showered, dressed in jeans and a sweater that Vivian would have called weekend tragic, and went downstairs. Ethan was already at the kitchen table. He hadn't slept either. She could tell by the bruised look around his eyes and the way his coffee sat untouched in front of him, steam long gone. He was still wearing yesterday's shirt. His hands were clasped together on the table like a man waiting to testify. "You said we'd talk today," he said. Marlene poured coffee, added cream, 2 sugars, took her time. Not to punish him, though part of her, a part she wasn't proud of, recognized that making him wait felt like the closest thing to power she'd had in months. "Talk," she said. "I called my mother this morning." Marlene set the cup down. "And?" "I told her what she said at dinner was unacceptable." "What did she say?" Ethan's jaw worked, that valve again, tightening and releasing. "She said I was being dramatic. She said she was only trying to help me see what everyone else already sees." "Which is what exactly?" "That we're," her word, "mismatched." The word landed on the kitchen tile between them like something dropped from a height. Mismatched, as though love were a fabric pattern and Marlene had committed the crime of clashing with the Caldwell upholstery. "And what did you say to that?" Marlene asked. Her voice was steady. She'd had years of practice keeping it steady. "I said she was wrong." "Did you say it like you meant it, or did you say it like you were asking permission?" Ethan looked at her. She saw the flash of hurt cross his face and felt nothing about it, which scared her more than the hurt itself. There had been a time when causing Ethan pain, even accidentally, even with truth, would have sent her scrambling to soften the blow. That instinct was dying. She could feel it dying the way you feel a tooth go numb before it falls out. Slowly, and then all at once. "I meant it, Marlene." "Then why are you sitting here looking like a man who just lost a fight?" He stood up, crossed to the counter, poured out his cold coffee and refilled the cup, and the whole time his back was to her, she could see the tension across his shoulders, the way his spine held itself rigid like a column bearing too much weight. "Because I did lose," he said, turning around. "Every time I talk to her, I lose. She has this way of, it's like she rearranges the room. By the time I leave, I'm not even sure what I went in to say. That's not a reason, Ethan. That's an excuse wearing a reason's clothes. What do you want from me? I told you last night, be the man you said you'd be." "I'm trying. Try harder." He flinched. She watched him flinch and cataloged it the way she cataloged everything now, with the detached precision of someone who'd stopped expecting things to change and started building a record of evidence instead. This is what he does. This is what he doesn't do. This is the gap between the man he wants to be and the man he actually is, measured in flinches and retreating footsteps and apologies that arrive 12 hours too late to mean anything. "I'm going to the library," Marlene said. "It's Sunday. I have inventory to finish. Marlene, we can talk more tonight, if you have something new to say." She left him standing in the kitchen with his fresh coffee cooling in his hand and that look on his face, the one that sat halfway between guilt and bewilderment, like a man who knew the building was on fire but couldn't find the exit. At the library, she unlocked the side door and sat at her desk in the back office with the overhead light off. The building was empty. Sunday quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't ask anything of you. She pulled out her phone and looked at Leonard's text again. The concept of second chances. She typed a response before she could talk herself out of it. For second chances, start with East of Eden by Steinbeck. It's about whether people can change or whether they're trapped by what came before them. Fair warning, it doesn't give you a comfortable answer. She hit send and set the phone down and pulled the inventory binder from the shelf and started counting. 20 minutes later, the phone buzzed. Steinbeck. Good. I read it 40 years ago, but I think I was too young to understand it. Maybe that's the point of second chances. You need to be old enough to know what you lost before you can appreciate what you might find. Are you at work on a Sunday? She typed back. Library doesn't judge me for showing up early. His reply came fast. Neither do I. Something about that sentence, its simplicity, its lack of agenda, cracked open a space inside her chest that she'd been keeping sealed. She sat in her desk chair in the dark office and pressed a hand to her sternum and breathed. Over the next 2 weeks, the texts became a routine. Not constant. Leonard wasn't the type to flood a conversation. He wrote the way he spoke, with precision and weight, and every message felt like it had been considered before it was sent. He asked her about books. She recommended them. He read them, actually read them, which she knew because his follow-up questions were specific and engaged in ways that people who merely skimmed could never fake. He asked about her work. She told him about the summer reading program she was designing for at-risk kids in the county. He asked about the budget. She laughed and told him there was no budget. He didn't offer money. He asked what she would do with one if she had it. She described a program so detailed and passionate that she surprised herself. Mobile library units, author visits, partnerships with the school district, a mentorship track for teenagers who needed somewhere to go after 3 o'clock. He listened. That was the thing. He listened the way people listen when they actually care about the answer, rather than waiting for their turn to talk. On a Wednesday evening, he called instead of texting. "I have a question that's going to sound strange," he said. No preamble, no small talk. Leonard Sterling moved through conversations the way he probably moved through everything, directly, efficiently, and with the absolute confidence of a man who'd learned decades ago that indirection was a luxury he couldn't afford. Strange how? Personal strange. Go ahead. Where were you born? Marlene paused. She was sitting on the back porch of the townhouse, watching the last light drain out of the sky. Ethan was inside on a call with his accountant. They'd talked twice more since Sunday morning, and both conversations had followed the same pattern. Ethan apologizing, Marlene accepting the apology, and both of them knowing that acceptance wasn't the same as resolution. Garrett County, she said. Small town called Ridgeview. Why? A silence on the line, not empty, loaded. The kind of silence that holds something it's not ready to release. And your parents? My mother raised me. Single mom. She passed 6 years ago. I never knew my father. She told me he left before I was born. Another silence, longer this time. Marlene could hear Leonard breathing, steady, controlled, but faster than usual, like a man running calculations that kept producing an answer he wasn't prepared for. Leonard? You still there? I'm here. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. It's just, you remind me of someone. Something about the way you carry yourself. Someone you lost? The question hung between them. She heard him exhale slowly, the way a man does when he's standing at the edge of something and hasn't decided whether to step forward or back. Yes, he said. Someone I lost a very long time ago. After they hung up, Marlene sat on the porch for another 30 minutes. The air smelled like cut grass and coming rain. She thought about Leonard's voice when he'd asked where she was born, the way it had shifted from its usual steadiness into something rawer, more exposed, like a man touching a wound he'd convinced himself had healed. Thursday. Vivian called. Not Marlene. Vivian would sooner swallow glass than dial Marlene's number directly. She called Ethan, and Marlene heard the conversation from the bedroom because Ethan took it in the hallway and the walls in the townhouse were thinner than either of them liked to pretend. The Hargrove girl, Vivian was saying. Philip Hargrove's daughter. She just finished her MBA at Wharton. Beautiful, well-spoken, and she comes from a family that understands how things work. Mom, stop. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, Ethan. I'm suggesting lunch. Is lunch a crime now? I'm married. Yes, we're all aware. The way she said it, we're all aware, carried the specific weight of a verdict that had already been decided. Marlene lay on the bed and listened and felt something fundamental shift inside her, like a foundation settling in a direction it was never meant to go. She'd spent 3 years believing that patience was a strategy, that if she was kind enough, good enough, present enough, the wall Vivian had built would eventually develop cracks and light would get through. But walls built by people like Vivian weren't designed to crack. They were designed to outlast, to stand there, permanent and indifferent, until the person on the other side stopped trying. Ethan appeared in the doorway. You heard that. Thin walls. I told her no. You told her to stop, Ethan. That's not the same as no. Stop means you'll tolerate it again later. No means there's a line she can't cross. You've never once given her a line. He leaned against the doorframe. She watched the exhaustion move across his face like weather across a plain. If I push too hard, she'll cut us off. Cut us off from what? Her money? Her approval? Because she's never given us her approval, and the money comes with so many strings, it might as well be a cage. It's not just money. It's the family. If I stand against her, she'll make it impossible. Caroline won't take my calls. Gerald will side with her. Marcus already does whatever she says. I'll lose everyone. You're losing me. The words left her mouth and hung in the room like smoke. Ethan stared at her. She could see him processing it. The sentence moving through him, landing in places he'd been protecting, cracking open things he'd kept sealed. Don't say that. It's not a threat. It's a fact. You're losing me, Ethan. Not because I stopped loving you, because I stopped being able to tell the difference between being loved and being tolerated. He crossed the room, sat on the bed beside her, took her hand in both of his and held it tight, too tight, the grip of a man who could feel something slipping and had no idea how to hold on except through force. I'll fix this, he said. When? Soon. That word doesn't mean anything anymore. Marlene, please give me time. She looked at him, at the face she'd fallen in love with 4 years ago in a bookshop on Maple Street, where he'd been standing in the poetry section looking lost, and she'd helped him find a gift for his mother's birthday. His mother. Even the beginning of their love story had Vivian's fingerprints on it. Your mother's birthday gala is in 3 weeks, Marlene said. I know. I'll go, because I'm your wife, and that's what wives do. But if she humiliates me again, in front of those people, in that room, and you sit there and let it happen, I'm done. Marlene, I'm done, Ethan. Not eventually. Not after another conversation. Done. He stared at her. She saw the moment he understood she wasn't performing, wasn't negotiating, wasn't leaving room for the comfortable ambiguity that had sustained their marriage through 3 years of Vivian's campaign. She was drawing a line, the kind of line that doesn't bend. Okay, he whispered. Okay, what? Okay, the gala. I'll handle it. Whatever she does, I'll handle it. She wanted to believe him. Wanting was easy. Believing was the part that cost something, and Marlene had spent 3 years paying a price she couldn't afford for beliefs that never delivered. She pulled her hand free, gently. Not to hurt him, to remind herself that she could. The next morning, she texted Leonard. What's a book about a woman who has to decide whether to keep fighting for something that might already be dead? His reply came in 20 minutes. That depends. Is she fighting for the thing, or for who she was before she started fighting? Marlene stared at the message. Read it 3 times, set the phone down, picked it up again. Both, she typed. I think she's fighting for both. Then she needs to know which one she can survive losing, because she can't lose both and still be standing. That evening, while Ethan cooked dinner and tried too hard to make conversation about weekend plans and whether they should repaint the guest room, Marlene sat at the kitchen table with Leonard's words running through her mind like water finding the lowest point in a landscape. Which one she can survive losing? She looked at Ethan, at the careful way he moved around the kitchen, at the sauce he was making from scratch because he knew she liked it, at the effort radiating from every gesture. He was trying. She could see him trying, but trying without changing was just performance, and performance without conviction was just noise shaped like love. Her phone buzzed again. Leonard, I need to see you. Something important. Can you meet me Saturday at the diner on Route 9? She typed back without hesitating. I'll be there at noon. She set the phone face down on the table. Ethan turned from the stove with a wooden spoon in his hand and a smile on his face that was working so hard to be normal it almost broke her heart. Smells good, she said. Your favorite. I know. They ate dinner. They talked about the guest room. They went to bed in the same house, in the same room, in the same silence they'd been perfecting for 3 years. The silence of 2 people lying side by side in the dark, close enough to touch, separated by everything neither of them had the courage to say. Somewhere across town, in a hotel suite that cost more per night than most families spent on rent, Leonard Sterling sat at a mahogany desk with a file open in front of him. Inside the file were documents he'd been collecting for 31 years. Birth records, adoption papers, hospital logs, correspondence with agencies that no longer existed, And a single photograph of a woman he'd loved in a life before wealth had made him into something the world recognized, and loneliness had made him into something it didn't. He picked up the photograph, turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, a name and a date. The name was Mary Ellen Hayes. The date was 31 years ago. And the face in the photograph, the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, the way the mouth held itself in a line that was equal parts stubborn and kind, was identical to the face of the woman who'd pulled over on a dark road in the rain and driven him to a gas station without asking for anything in return. He closed the file, picked up his phone, called a number he'd been calling for 3 decades, his private investigator. The man answered on the first ring, the way people answer when the person calling pays enough to make waiting a liability. "I need a DNA comparison," Leonard said. "Rush it. I don't care what it costs." He hung up, sat in the dark. And for the first time in 31 years, Leonard Sterling, a man who'd built an empire on certainty, felt his hand shake. Saturday arrived the way inevitable things do. Not with announcement, but with the quiet certainty of a clock hand reaching a number it was always going to reach. Marlene drove to the diner on Route 9 with the windows cracked despite the chill, letting the air cut against her face because she needed something sharp and physical to keep her grounded. She hadn't told Ethan where she was going. He'd left early for a meeting with his mother's financial advisor. Vivian's gala was 2 weeks out, and the machinery of her extravagance required attendance from everyone in the family orbit, including the son she controlled and the daughter-in-law she despised. Leonard was already in the booth when she arrived. Same seat as the first night. Black coffee. Untouched. But something about him had changed. She saw it the moment she sat down. A tension in his frame that didn't match the man she'd been texting for weeks. His hands were on the table, fingers laced together, and there was a stillness to him that felt less like calm and more like a man holding himself in place by force of will. "You look serious," Marlene said. "I am serious. More serious than usual, I mean." He looked at her. Those dark, sharp eyes that she'd come to associate with warmth and curiosity and the rare gift of genuine attention, they were doing something different now. Studying her. Mapping her face the way you map terrain when you're looking for landmarks you've only seen in photographs. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." Marlene's stomach tightened. She'd spent 3 years developing an instinct for moments that were about to change the shape of her life, and that instinct was firing now. Hard, insistent, like an alarm going off behind her ribs. "Okay." Leonard opened a leather portfolio she hadn't noticed beside him. From it he produced a photograph. Old, edges soft with handling, the colors faded into that warm amber cast that time gives to everything it touches. He slid it across the table. Marlene looked at it. A young woman, mid-20s, standing in a garden with sunlight on her face. Dark hair, strong jaw. A mouth that held itself in a line Marlene recognized because she saw it every morning in the mirror. "Who is this?" Her name was Mary Ellen Hayes. The surname hit Marlene like a hand across the face. Her maiden name, Hayes. She looked up at Leonard and felt something fundamental rearrange itself inside her chest. Not understanding yet, but the precursor to understanding, the way the air changes pressure before a storm makes landfall. "She was your mother," Leonard said. "Your biological mother. Not the woman who raised you. Though she was a good woman too, and I owe her a debt I can never repay. Mary Ellen was the woman I loved before my life became what it became. We were young. I had nothing. She had less. And when she got pregnant, I made the worst decision of my life. I left to try to build something, to become someone who could provide for a family. By the time I came back, she was gone. The baby was gone. Adoption records sealed, and I spent the next 31 years looking." Marlene couldn't speak. The diner sounds, the coffee maker hissing, a truck pulling in outside, Bev calling an order through the window. All of it receded into a distance that felt like miles. She was staring at the photograph, at the woman's eyes, which were her eyes, at the woman's jaw, which was her jaw, at the woman's hands clasped together in front of her body in exactly the way Marlene clasped hers when she was trying to hold herself together. That's not... The words came out broken, disconnected, like tiles falling off a wall. My mother was Sandra Hayes. She raised me in Ridgeview. She was a waitress. Sandra was Mary Ellen's cousin. When Mary Ellen realized she couldn't care for you, she was sick, Marlene, sicker than anyone knew at the time. She asked Sandra to take you, not through the system, off the books, because she was afraid that if the state got involved, she'd never know where you ended up. Sandra agreed. She raised you as her own. Mary Ellen died 8 months later. The diner tilted. Not physically. The floor stayed level, the table stayed solid under her hands. But something in Marlene's internal architecture shifted so violently that the world seemed to lean sideways for a full 3 seconds. She gripped the edge of the table, breathed, forced air into lungs that had forgotten their purpose. "You're telling me you're my father." "I'm telling you that I believe I am, and I have evidence." He pulled a second document from the portfolio. DNA analysis. 2 columns of numbers that meant nothing to her and everything to the man sitting across from her. "I had a private lab run a comparison. Hair from the brush you left in my car the night you drove me, compared against my own sample. The probability of paternal relation is 99.7%. Marlene stared at the document, the numbers blurred. She realized she was crying only when a tear hit the paper and darkened a small circle over a data point she couldn't read anyway. "You took my hair." "From the brush in your car. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like you've been investigating me." "I have." He didn't flinch from it, didn't soften it. Leonard Sterling was many things, but a man who dressed truth in comfortable clothing was not one of them. "From the moment I saw your face on that road, Marlene, you look exactly like her. Exactly. And when you told me your name was Hayes and you were from Garrett County and your mother raised you alone, I knew, before the DNA, before the records, before any of it, I knew the way you know your own heartbeat." She pushed back from the table, not standing, not leaving, just creating distance. Physical space to match the psychological chasm that had just opened beneath her feet. Everything she'd built her identity on. Sandra Hayes' daughter, the girl from Ridgeview, the woman who'd made herself from nothing because nothing was all she'd been given. All of it was reshuffling, not disappearing, reshuffling. The facts of her life hadn't changed, but the story they told had just been rewritten by a man she'd known for 3 weeks. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I wanted to be sure, and because—" He paused. For the first time since she'd met him, Leonard Sterling looked uncertain. Not weak, never weak, but confronted by something his money and his mind couldn't control. "Because I was afraid that you'd think I was using the connection, that you'd think this was about money, or manipulation, or some old man's desperate need to fill an empty space in his life. I wanted you to know me first, as a person, before I became whatever this makes me." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The gesture was raw, graceless, exactly the kind of thing Vivian would have called common. She didn't care. She was sitting in a diner on Route 9, learning that the life she'd understood was built on a foundation she'd never seen, and the fact that her mascara was running was so far down the list of things that mattered, it might as well not exist. "I need time," she said. "Take all of it." "I mean, this changes everything, Leonard. Or nothing. I don't know which yet." "It changes one thing," he said quietly. "You are not alone. Whatever else this means, whatever else you decide, you are not standing in that family's dining room by yourself anymore." Marlene drove home. She didn't remember the route. Her body handled the mechanics, steering, braking, signaling, while her mind ran in circles around a center it couldn't locate. Father. The word kept surfacing and she kept pushing it back down. Not because she rejected it, but because she wasn't ready to hold it yet. Some truths are too heavy to pick up on the first try. You have to circle them, test their weight, figure out which muscles you'll need before you lift. She told no one. Not Ethan, not Janet, not anyone. She carried the knowledge through the next 2 weeks like a stone in her pocket, always present, always heavy, reshaping the way she moved through rooms and conversations without anyone noticing the extra weight. The gala arrived on a Friday night, Vivian's 71st birthday. The Caldwell estate was lit from every window, the kind of theatrical illumination that exists not to see by, but to be seen. 300 guests, catered by people flown in from somewhere expensive. A string quartet in the foyer and ice sculptures in the garden, and enough flowers to fill every room Marlene had ever lived in twice over. She wore a black dress. Simple. Fitted. The kind of dress that didn't try to compete because competing would mean acknowledging that competition existed. Ethan stood beside her in the receiving line with his hand on the small of her back, present, attentive, performing the role of devoted husband with the polished competence of a man who'd been raised to perform. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you. You seem different tonight." "Different how?" "I don't know, like you're braced for something." She was. She'd texted Leonard that morning. He knew about the gala. He knew about Vivian. Over the past 2 weeks, their conversations had deepened into something Marlene couldn't easily categorize. Not quite father and daughter, not quite friends, but something forged in the overlap between two people who'd been missing pieces of themselves and had found those pieces reflected in each other. She'd told him about Ethan, about Vivian, about the ultimatum she'd issued. He'd listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, without the anxious need to fix things that most people mistook for caring. He hadn't said he was coming tonight. She hadn't asked him to. But something in his last text, "I won't let anyone hurt my daughter," had carried a weight that went beyond words on a screen. The gala was 2 hours old when Vivian struck. Marlene was standing near the bar, talking to Gerald's wife about the library's summer program, when Vivian's voice cut through the ambient noise of 300 people pretending to enjoy themselves. "Everyone, if I could have your attention." The crowd turned. Vivian stood at the center of the ballroom in a gown that probably cost more than Marlene's car, holding a champagne glass with the practiced elegance of a woman who'd been commanding rooms since before most of her guests were born. Her silver hair caught the light. Her smile was flawless. She was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful, precisely shaped, functionally dangerous, and completely indifferent to the damage it was designed to inflict. "I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate with my family tonight. The Caldwell name has meant something in this community for 4 generations, and looking around this room, I'm reminded of why. We are surrounded by people of substance, people of accomplishment, people who understand that legacy is not inherited, it is earned." Her eyes found Marlene, held her. The crowd didn't notice. To them, Vivian was making a general speech, but Marlene knew. She could feel the crosshairs settle on her chest the way prey feels the moment before the shot. Of course, every family faces challenges. Every family must navigate the question of who belongs and who, with all due respect, simply does not understand the responsibilities that come with a name like ours. My son Ethan is a wonderful man, brilliant, generous, but even brilliant men sometimes make choices based on emotion rather than judgment. And when that happens, it falls to the family to gently, lovingly point out what everyone else can already see. The room went quiet. Not all at once. It rippled outward from the people standing closest to Vivian, the ones who could see where her gaze was aimed. Marlene felt every set of eyes in the room shift toward her. 300 people. 300 witnesses to the most public execution Vivian had ever orchestrated. "There's nothing wrong with modesty," Vivian continued, her voice dropping into that register of false compassion that Marlene knew better than her own heartbeat. "Nothing wrong with a simple life. A school librarian is a perfectly respectable profession, but let's not pretend that—" The ballroom doors opened, not with a dramatic crash, with a slow, deliberate swing that drew every head in the room. 2 men in dark suits entered first, moving with the choreographed efficiency of professional security. Behind them, 3 people in business attire carrying tablet devices and wearing earpieces. And behind them, walking with the unhurried stride of a man who'd spent his entire life entering rooms that rearranged themselves around his presence, was Leonard Sterling. Marlene stopped breathing. The recognition moved through the crowd like a wave. Not everyone knew his face. Leonard Sterling had spent decades avoiding public attention with the same discipline he applied to accumulating wealth. But enough people did. Enough people had seen the Forbes covers, the rare interviews, the business journal profiles of a man who controlled a portfolio that made the Caldwell fortune look like pocket change. Whispers broke out across the ballroom. Phones appeared. The string quartet stopped playing. Vivian's champagne glass lowered. Her smile didn't disappear. It froze, which was worse. The smile of a woman who sensed the ground shifting beneath her but hadn't yet calculated how far she was going to fall. Leonard crossed the ballroom. He didn't look at Vivian. Didn't look at Ethan, who had gone completely still near the bar with a drink in his hand and his mouth slightly open. Leonard walked directly to Marlene. He stopped in front of her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Firm, warm, deliberate. A gesture that was simultaneously intimate and declarative. A man claiming territory. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said. His voice carried, not because he raised it, but because 300 people had stopped breathing and the room had become a vacuum waiting to be filled. Vivian recovered first. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other? This is a private event." Leonard turned to face her. The movement was slow, measured. The rotation of a man who had destroyed corporations, collapsed markets, and rebuilt entire industries, and who now directed the full weight of that capacity toward a woman holding a champagne glass in a room full of people she'd believed she controlled. "My name is Leonard Sterling," he said, "and you don't know me. But you know my daughter." The word detonated in the center of the room. Daughter. 300 heads turned to Marlene. Vivian's frozen smile cracked, not visibly, not in a way anyone could have photographed, but in the architecture beneath it, in the structural certainty that had held her upright and dominant for 6 decades. "I searched for her for 31 years, Leonard continued. His voice didn't waver. His hand stayed on Marlene's shoulder. "After her mother died, after the records were sealed, after every trail went cold, I searched, and I found her. Not because of money, not because of investigators or databases or the resources that people like you worship. I found her because she did what no one in this room would have done. She stopped her car on a dark road in a rainstorm to help a stranger." He looked at Vivian the way gravity looks at everything beneath it, with the absolute impersonal certainty of a force that cannot be negotiated with. "Marlene is my daughter. She carries the Sterling name by blood, and the woman you just publicly humiliated in front of 300 people is worth more than every person in this room combined. Not because of me, not because of my money, but because she is the only person I've met in 30 years whose first instinct when encountering someone in trouble was to stop and help." Marlene stood in the center of the ballroom with Leonard's hand on her shoulder and 300 faces staring at her, and felt the entire framework of her life, the identity she'd built, the battles she'd fought, the quiet dignity she'd maintained in the face of 3 years of contempt, all of it lifting and rearranging itself into a shape she didn't recognize yet, but could feel forming, the way you feel a word on the tip of your tongue before you can say it. She looked at Ethan. He was standing by the bar with tears on his face and an expression she had never seen on him before. Not guilt, not shame, but the devastating clarity of a man who had just realized, in front of everyone he'd ever known, exactly how badly he had failed the person who deserved his courage most. She looked at Vivian. The woman's champagne glass was shaking. Not her hand. The glass. The tremor was small, almost invisible, but Marlene saw it. After 3 years of studying Vivian Caldwell's every gesture, every micro-expression, every calculated inflection, Marlene saw the first crack she'd never seen before. Not defeat. Vivian was too formidable for defeat. But doubt. The first doubt. The realization that the woman she'd spent 3 years dismissing as common and beneath her family had just become someone Vivian couldn't afford to dismiss. And the rules Vivian had built her entire world on. Money determines value, background determines worth, power flows downward from those who hold it to those who don't, had just been broken by a 73-year-old man in an expensive coat who loved his daughter more than he loved his empire. Marlene reached up and placed her hand over Leonard's on her shoulder. The room held its breath. And Marlene Hayes, the librarian, the quiet wife, the woman who'd endured 3 years of contempt with nothing but kindness as her armor, looked at the 300 faces staring at her and understood, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has just been handed the weapon they never knew they needed, that everything from this moment forward would require her to become someone she had never been. Not harder. Not crueler. Not the mirror image of the woman who'd tormented her. Something more dangerous than any of those things. Herself. Without apology. without permission, without the need for anyone in this room, husband, mother-in-law, or stranger, to tell her she was enough. The champagne glass in Vivian's hand stopped shaking. The woman straightened, her eyes narrowed, and Marlene saw it. The recalculation happening behind that impeccable face. Not surrender, strategy. Vivian Caldwell was not the kind of woman who crumbled. She was the kind who adapted, who found new angles, who turned devastation into ammunition. The war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. And for the first time, Marlene was standing in it without wondering if she deserved to fight. The ballroom didn't recover. It rearranged. 300 people recalibrated in real time, adjusting postures, recalculating allegiances, performing the invisible mathematics that the wealthy do when the power structure in a room shifts without warning. Marlene could feel it happening around her, the gravitational realignment, the way conversations that had been aimed in one direction suddenly bent toward another. 5 minutes ago, she'd been the woman Vivian Caldwell publicly dismissed. Now she was Leonard Sterling's daughter, and the distance between those two identities was measured in billions. Leonard's hand stayed on her shoulder, steady, not possessive, declarative. The difference mattered. Possessive was Vivian's language, the grammar of people who held things because they were afraid of what would happen if they let go. Declarative was something else entirely. It said, "This is mine, and I am not afraid to stand next to it." Vivian recovered faster than anyone in the room expected. That was her gift. Not intelligence, though she had that, and not cruelty, though she had that too. Her gift was adaptation, the ability to absorb a blow and reconfigure around it before the bruise had time to form. She set her champagne glass on the nearest table, smoothed the front of her gown, and turned to Leonard with a smile that had been rebuilt from the wreckage of the one that had cracked 30 seconds earlier. "Mr. Sterling, what a remarkable surprise. I had no idea we shared such a connection." "You didn't," Leonard said, "because you never bothered to learn anything about the woman your son married beyond how to tear her apart." The words landed without heat. That was what made them devastating. Leonard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke the way a man speaks when he's spent 50 years in rooms where the wrong word costs millions and the right word builds empires, with precision, economy, and the complete absence of wasted energy. Vivian's smile tightened. Around them, guests were doing what guests do at these moments, pretending not to listen while absorbing every syllable. Caroline had materialized near the ice sculpture, her phone in her hand, her face carrying the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Gerald was at the bar, gripping his scotch with both hands. Marcus had disappeared entirely. "Perhaps," Vivian said, and her voice had dropped into that register of controlled warmth that Marlene knew was the most dangerous version of her. "We should continue this conversation somewhere more private." "No," Leonard said. "You humiliated my daughter in front of these people. They can hear what I have to say." The word daughter moved through the crowd again. Marlene watched it land on face after face, shock, recalculation, the rapid adjustment of people who suddenly realized they'd been complicit in something far uglier than they'd allowed themselves to acknowledge. She'd seen these same faces at a dozen Caldwell events, had smiled at them while Vivian carved pieces off her in public, and not one of them, not a single one, had ever intervened. They'd watched the way people watch cruelty when it doesn't cost them anything to ignore it, comfortable, uninvolved, safely positioned on the side of whoever held power. Ethan moved through the crowd toward her. She saw him coming and felt something complicated twist in her chest. Love and anger and exhaustion braided so tightly together she couldn't separate them anymore. He reached her side and stood there, close but not touching, his face raw and open in a way she'd never seen at any Caldwell function. The mask was gone. Whatever performance he'd been maintaining for years had collapsed under the weight of what had just happened, and what was left was a man stripped down to his essential components: love, shame, and the terrible clarity of realizing too late what courage looked like. "Marlene," he said, just her name. But he said it the way a man says a word when he finally understands what it means. "Not now, Ethan. I need to... not now." He stopped. She watched him absorb the refusal. 3 years ago, it would have broken her to speak to him that way. Even 6 months ago, she would have softened it, would have added context or reassurance or some gesture that let him know she still needed him. She didn't do any of those things. Not because she'd stopped caring, but because she'd arrived at the place beyond caring where clarity lived. That stripped, wind-scoured landscape where you could finally see the difference between what you wanted and what you required. She wanted Ethan. She required someone who could stand beside her without being told to stand. Vivian was talking to Leonard. Marlene couldn't hear the words. They'd moved several feet away, and the crowd noise had risen to fill the vacuum left by the initial shock. But she could read Vivian's body language with the fluency of 3 years' study. The slight forward lean that meant she was on offense. The angle of her chin that meant she was measuring her opponent. The way her hands stayed visible and still, because Vivian understood that visible stillness projected control better than any gesture. Leonard was giving her nothing. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral, his eyes steady on Vivian's face with the patience of a man who'd negotiated with heads of state and found none of them particularly impressive. Vivian was accustomed to being the most formidable person in any room. She was not accustomed to meeting someone who made her formidability irrelevant. Caroline appeared at Marlene's elbow. Her sister-in-law's face was flushed, her eyes wide, her voice pitched at the specific frequency of someone trying to manage a crisis they didn't cause and couldn't control. "Is this real?" "Yes." "Leonard Sterling is you're actually his—" "Yes, Caroline." "Does Ethan know?" "He does now." Caroline looked across the room at her mother. For the first time in Marlene's memory, something other than loyalty moved across Caroline's face, something that looked like the early stages of reckoning. The moment when a person who's been standing behind someone else's authority begins to wonder what they've been standing behind and whether it deserves their support. "She went too far tonight," Caroline said quietly. "She went too far 3 years ago. Tonight is just the first time anyone noticed." The gala continued around them because galas are machines designed to keep running regardless of what happens inside them. The string quartet resumed. Waiters circulated with champagne. Conversations restarted in lower registers, weighted now with the currency of gossip that would fuel this social circle for months. Marlene stood in the center of it all and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of being simultaneously exposed and armored. Every eye in the room was on her, every whisper was about her. And for the first time, the attention wasn't corrosive, it was clarifying. She could see herself reflected in 300 gazes, and the woman she saw standing there was not the diminished, apologetic version that Vivian had been constructing for 3 years. She was something else, something that had been there all along, buried under compliance and patience and the exhausting daily work of trying to earn a place she'd always deserved. Leonard returned to her side. His face gave away nothing, but his eyes, when they met hers, carried something she recognized. The look of a man who had just finished a negotiation and was satisfied with the terms but not celebratory. Leonard Sterling didn't celebrate victories. He filed them and moved on. "We should go," he said. "What did she say?" "Nothing worth repeating. She tried to reframe the situation. I declined." "Declined how?" "I told her that the woman she's spent 3 years humiliating is the sole heir to an estate worth more than the Caldwell holdings multiplied by 40, and that if she wished to continue having a relationship with her son's wife, and by extension, with the Sterling family's resources and influence, she would need to begin by publicly apologizing. Tonight." Marlene felt her pulse in her throat. Sole heir. The words sat in her mind like objects she could see but hadn't yet picked up. She'd known, intellectually, abstractly, that Leonard's wealth was significant, but hearing it quantified against the Caldwell fortune, the fortune that had been used as a weapon against her for 3 years, produced a sensation she wasn't prepared for. Not triumph, something more complicated. The disorienting recognition that the ground you'd been fighting to hold was never actually the ground that mattered. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "I know. I don't want her to apologize because she's afraid of your money, Leonard. That's not an apology. That's compliance." He looked at her. She saw something move through his expression, surprise maybe, or recognition, or the particular pride of a father encountering the version of his values reflected in a child he'd only just found. "You sound like your mother," he said. Which one? Both. They left the gala through a side door. The night air hit Marlene's face like cold water, sharp and clarifying. Behind them, the Caldwell estate glowed like a stage set, beautiful, expensive, and fundamentally artificial. She stood in the gravel drive and breathed and felt the sweat cooling along her spine where the dress pressed against her skin. Ethan appeared in the doorway. He'd followed them, of course. She'd known he would. He stood silhouetted against the light from inside, and his posture reminded her of the night in the library parking lot. A man who wanted to close a distance he'd created but didn't know how to move. Marlene, please. She turned. Leonard stepped back, not away, but to the side, giving her room while remaining present. The geometry of it was deliberate. He wasn't retreating. He was creating space for whatever was about to happen while making it clear that the space was protected. Say what you need to say, Ethan. He came down the steps. Up close, she could see the damage the evening had inflicted. The redness around his eyes, the way his collar was loosened like he'd been pulling at it, the specific pallor of a man whose entire understanding of his life had been dismantled in the span of 5 minutes. I failed you. Yes. Not tonight, I know it wasn't just tonight. I've been failing you since the beginning, every dinner, every comment she made, every time I sat there and let her. His voice cracked, not theatrically, the genuine fracture of a man hitting a load-bearing wall inside himself. I let her do it because I was afraid, because I've been afraid of her my entire life, and I turned that into something I told myself was loyalty. But it wasn't loyalty. It was cowardice. And you paid for it. Marlene looked at him. She felt the pull, the deep gravitational pull of the man she'd married, standing in front of her stripped of every defense, every excuse, every comfortable fiction he'd maintained. This was the Ethan she'd fallen in love with in the bookshop, raw, honest, capable of seeing himself clearly even when the clarity was devastating. But seeing clearly and acting differently were not the same thing. She'd learned that the hard way. Clarity without follow-through was just another form of performance. What are you going to do about it? She asked. Whatever you need, whatever it takes. That's not specific enough. I'll talk to her. Tomorrow. I'll set a boundary, a real one. And if she doesn't respect it, we'll walk away. From the family, from the money, from all of it. You don't know how to walk away from your mother, Ethan. You've never done it. Not once. Then I'll learn. And if you can't? The question hung between them. She watched it work on him. Watched the war play out across his face, the desperate desire to promise something he wasn't sure he could deliver versus the integrity to admit he might not be capable. This was the pivot point. Not the gala, not Leonard's entrance, not the revelation of her parentage. This. The moment when Ethan Caldwell stood at the edge of everything he'd been and everything he might become and had to decide which direction to step. The thing about people who've been conditioned since birth to serve someone else's authority is that breaking free doesn't happen in one dramatic gesture. It happens in the accumulation of small, agonizing choices, each one a tiny act of treason against the person who built the cage. Ethan's cage was gilded and comfortable and had his mother's name on every bar, and the key wasn't courage alone. The key was the willingness to accept that using it would cost him everything familiar. If I can't, Ethan said slowly, then you should leave me, and I won't fight it. She stared at him. He held her gaze. She saw no flinch, no retreat, no escape hatch hiding behind the words. He meant it. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan Caldwell had said something about their marriage that carried the full weight of consequence, and he hadn't tried to cushion it or qualify it or leave himself a way back. Okay, she said. Okay? I heard you. Now prove it. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Not as surrender, as a test. The last test. His fingers closed around hers and she felt the tremor in his grip, the physical evidence of a man holding something he knew he didn't deserve but was prepared finally to fight for. Behind them, the door to the estate opened. Light spilled across the gravel. Vivian stood in the doorway. She'd changed. Not her clothes, not her hair. Something beneath the surface had shifted. The imperious carriage was still there, the lifted chin, the architectural posture of a woman who'd spent her life standing above everyone in every room. But her eyes were different, harder and softer simultaneously, the way metal looks after it's been heated to the point of malleability. She was still dangerous, possibly more dangerous now than before, because a person who feels their control slipping will do things that a person in control never has to consider. "Ethan," Vivian said, "come inside." Ethan didn't move. Marlene felt his hand tighten around hers, not the reflexive clench of a man grabbing for safety, the deliberate compression of someone planting himself in a position and deciding not to be moved. She looked at his face. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on his mother. And in the space between his body and hers, in the 3 inches of October air that separated his shoulder from Marlene's, something was being built that hadn't existed before. Not a wall. A line. The kind of line that says, "This is where you stop." "No, Mom." 1 word, 2 letters. The smallest possible rebellion and the most enormous thing Ethan Caldwell had ever said to his mother. Vivian's face didn't change. That was the terrifying part. She absorbed the refusal the way water absorbs a stone, closing over it, adjusting, leaving no visible mark while the impact sank to depths no one could see. "I see," she said. And then, looking past Ethan to Marlene, with an expression that combined wounded dignity and cold calculation in proportions that only Vivian Caldwell could achieve. "I hope you understand what you've started." "I didn't start anything," Marlene said. "You did. 3 years ago." Vivian held her gaze. Seconds passed. Marlene didn't look away. She felt the weight of 3 years pressing against the back of her eyes. Every insult, every dismissal, every dinner where she'd sat quietly absorbing damage while the man beside her studied his plate. All of it compressed into this moment, this locked gaze. This silent contest between 2 women who had finally arrived at the place where pretense was useless and the only currency left was will. Vivian turned and went inside. The door closed behind her. The estate went dark room by room. The gala was over. The guests would leave through the front, pouring into their expensive cars with their expensive gossip, carrying the story of tonight into a world that would reshape it with each retelling until the truth was buried under layers of interpretation and social convenience. Marlene stood in the dark with Ethan's hand in hers, and Leonard Sterling standing 6 feet behind them, a man who'd spent 31 years searching for his daughter and had found her standing in the exact place where she was needed most, between the person she loved and the force that was trying to destroy her. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of performance. Marlene looked at the dark house. Somewhere inside, Vivian Caldwell was recalculating, planning. The woman had never lost a fight in her life, and she wasn't going to accept this as a first without retaliation. Whatever came next, and something was coming, Marlene could feel it the way she'd always felt Vivian's attacks, in the tightening of air before the blow, would be more dangerous than anything that had come before. Because now Vivian wasn't fighting to control her family. She was fighting to survive the loss of that control. And a person fighting for survival doesn't follow rules. "Now," Marlene said, "we find out who we actually are." The night swallowed the estate behind them. Ahead, the drive stretched into darkness, and somewhere at the end of it was a road. And at the end of the road was a life that neither of them had lived yet. One that would require Marlene to hold the kindness that defined her in one hand, and the ferocity she'd just discovered in the other, and somehow keep both without letting either destroy the balance. She didn't know if she could do it. She was about to find out. 3 days after the gala, Vivian Caldwell did something she had never done in 71 years of living. She called Marlene directly. The phone rang at 7 in the morning. Marlene was at the kitchen table with coffee and a stack of grant applications for the library's summer program. Leonard had quietly connected her with a foundation that funded literacy initiatives, and the paperwork was dense and real and exactly the kind of problem she knew how to solve. She looked at the screen. Vivian Caldwell. The name sat there glowing like a small, contained emergency. She answered. "Marlene." Vivian's voice was different, not warm. Vivian would never be warm the way sunlight is warm or the way a hand on your shoulder is warm. But the blade had been sheathed. The cutting edge that had defined every interaction for 3 years was absent, replaced by something Marlene had never heard from this woman before. Effort. The audible sound of someone working against their own nature to produce words that didn't come naturally. Vivian, I would like to speak with you. In person. Today, if possible. Marlene set her coffee down. She could hear Ethan in the shower upstairs, the pipes groaning in the walls the way they always did. 3 days since the gala. 3 days since Ethan had said no to his mother in the gravel drive and meant it. 3 days of a silence from the Caldwell estate that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a second wave. Where? Marlene asked. My home, 11 o'clock. I'll be there. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand and thought about what it meant that Vivian had called her instead of routing through Ethan. For 3 years, Marlene had been a problem Vivian addressed indirectly. Through comments aimed at the table rather than the person, through suggestions funneled through her son, through the elaborate architecture of contempt that allowed her to destroy someone without ever technically speaking to them. A direct call was new. A direct call meant Vivian had been forced to acknowledge that Marlene existed as a person rather than a problem. Ethan came downstairs with wet hair and the cautious energy of a man who'd been walking carefully around his own life for 3 days, testing each step before committing his weight to it. Since the gala, something had shifted between them. Not repaired. Shifted. The way a broken bone shifts before it can be set. Painful, necessary, and impossible to rush. Who was on the phone? Your mother. His jaw tightened. The old reflex. But she watched him override it, watched the conscious effort move across his face as he chose not to default to the pattern that had governed him for 34 years. What did she want? To talk. I'm going over at 11. I'll come with you. No. He looked at her. She saw the flash of protest form and dissolve before it reached his mouth. He was learning, slowly, imperfectly, the way people learn anything that requires them to unlearn something else first. 3 days wasn't long enough to rebuild a man's relationship with his own courage, but it was long enough to see whether the foundation was there. And it was. She could see it. Fragile, untested, but present. Okay, he said. But if you need me, I know where to find you. She drove to the Caldwell estate at 10:45. The house looked different in daylight. Smaller somehow, stripped of the theatrical lighting that made it feel like a monument. It was just a house. Large, well-maintained, expensive, but just a house. The power it held was borrowed from the woman inside it, and that power, Marlene understood now, had always been more fragile than it appeared. Vivian's authority was like a building constructed entirely on reputation, impressive from the outside, load-bearing only as long as nobody tested the walls. The housekeeper led her to the sunroom. Vivian was seated in a chair by the window, dressed simply. No jewelry except her wedding ring, no gown, no armor. The absence of ornamentation was itself a statement. Vivian Caldwell did nothing by accident, and showing up unadorned to a meeting with the woman she'd spent 3 years attacking was either vulnerability or strategy, possibly both. With Vivian, the two were never as far apart as they seemed. Sit down, Marlene. Marlene sat. The sunroom smelled like cut flowers and furniture polish. Morning light came through the windows at an angle that made everything look clean and slightly unreal, like a photograph of a room rather than the room itself. I owe you an apology, Vivian said. The words came out measured, deliberate, each one placed like a stone in a wall being built by someone who'd never done masonry. Marlene could hear the effort behind them, the grinding resistance of a woman whose entire identity was constructed around never admitting fault, forcing herself to do the one thing her nature made nearly impossible. For what specifically? Marlene asked. Not to be cruel. Because specificity mattered. A general apology was just a door you could close without entering the room. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. Then she exhaled. A long, slow release that carried more weight than any words she'd spoken in the previous 3 years. For the way I've treated you since the day my son brought you home. For the things I said at dinner tables when I knew you could hear them and when I thought you couldn't. For the investigator I hired before your wedding. For every comment about your clothes, your career, your family. For the Hargrove girl. for the gala. She paused. Her hands were folded in her lap, and Marlene noticed they were still. Not the practiced stillness of performance, but the stillness of someone concentrating very hard on not falling apart. For making you feel that you were not enough. When the truth I refuse to see, is that you were always more than enough. You were better than this family deserved. Marlene sat with that. She let the silence hold the words the way water holds a reflection, giving them space to settle, to show their true shape without distortion. She'd imagined this moment more times than she could count. In her fantasies, it had always been cathartic. The grand vindication, the tearful surrender, the moment when justice finally caught up with cruelty and everything balanced out. But sitting here in this quiet room, looking at a 71-year-old woman who had spent her entire life believing that control was the same as strength and was now confronting the wreckage of that belief, it didn't feel like vindication. It felt like watching someone realize they'd been building on a fault line. Why? Marlene asked. Why what? Why did you hate me? Vivian looked at her. Marlene saw something surface in the older woman's face that she'd never seen before. Not anger, not contempt, not the armored superiority that had defined every interaction. Something unguarded. The face beneath the face. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment Marlene glimpsed the architecture of a woman who'd been performing strength for so long she'd forgotten what it was protecting. Because you were everything I wasn't, Vivian said. Kind without agenda. Generous without keeping score. My son looked at you the way no one has ever looked at me. Not because I'm not worth it, but because I spent my life making sure no one could get close enough to try. You terrified me, Marlene. Not because you were inadequate, because you were proof that the things I valued, money, status, control, weren't the things that mattered, and if that was true, then I'd wasted my life. The honesty of it sat in the room like a third person, raw, uncomfortable, and too large for the furniture. Marlene understood something then that she hadn't expected to understand. Cruelty of the kind Vivian practiced, sustained, systematic, aimed at the softest parts of the people closest to you, was never really about the target. It was about the void inside the person swinging the blade. You don't spend 3 years trying to destroy someone's sense of worth, unless your own is already demolished. Vivian hadn't been attacking Marlene. She'd been attacking the mirror Marlene held up simply by existing. The reflection that showed Vivian what kindness looked like when it wasn't transactional, what love looked like when it wasn't conditional, what strength looked like when it didn't require someone else's diminishment. I don't forgive you because you're sorry, Marlene said. I forgive you because carrying the alternative is more weight than I'm willing to keep. Vivian blinked. Once, twice. Her eyes were bright but not wet. She was not a woman who cried easily, and even in this, even in the most honest moment of her life, the discipline held. But the brightness was there, proof that something behind the walls was responding, even if the walls themselves refused to come all the way down. You're a remarkable woman, Marlene. I'm a librarian who married your son and stopped her car in the rain for a stranger. There's nothing remarkable about any of that. It's just what people do when they haven't forgotten how to be decent. Vivian smiled. Actual, genuine, imperfect. The kind of smile that surfaces when the muscles doing the work haven't been used in years and aren't sure they remember the correct formation. It was small and crooked, and it transformed her face in ways that 3 decades of careful composition never had. They talked for another hour, not easily. Nothing between them would ever be easy, and Marlene didn't expect it to be. Some relationships are not meant to become comfortable. They're meant to become honest, which is harder and more valuable and far less pleasant. Vivian asked about the library. Marlene told her about the summer program, the grant applications, the mobile units she was planning. Vivian listened with a concentration that felt like a muscle being exercised for the first time. And when Marlene finished, the older woman said, "Tell me how I can help. And don't be polite about it. Tell me what you actually need." Marlene drove home with the windows down and the spring air moving through the car. She felt lighter. Not happy, not healed, but lighter. The way a building feels after load-bearing walls that were never necessary get removed. The structure was still standing. It was standing better, in fact, because the weight it was carrying now was weight that belonged to it rather than weight that had been imposed from outside. Leonard met her for dinner that evening at the diner on Route 9. Their diner now, the cracked vinyl booth where an old man and his lost daughter had begun the slow, uncertain work of becoming family. He was reading when she arrived, Steinbeck, because of course it was Steinbeck, the book she'd recommended on their first real exchange, and the fact that he was rereading it told her everything about who Leonard Sterling was beneath the wealth and the empire and the decades of solitary purpose. He was a man who took recommendations seriously, who revisited things, who believed that understanding deepened with repetition and that the best books, like the best people, revealed more of themselves each time you returned. "How did it go?" he asked. She apologized. "Did you believe her?" "I believe that she meant it today. Whether she means it tomorrow is something I'll deal with tomorrow." Leonard looked at her with an expression that had become familiar over the past weeks, pride layered with something more tender, more fragile. The look of a man who'd spent 31 years searching for the one thing his money couldn't buy and had found it in a woman who valued a library card over a balance sheet. "You handled it better than I would have," he said. "You would have bought her house and turned it into a public library." "Don't think I didn't consider it." She laughed. It came out full and warm, and it filled the booth the way laughter is supposed to fill a space, by making it bigger. "I want you to know something," Leonard said. He set the book down and folded his hands on the table. "I didn't come back into your life to fix it. I came back because you were missing from mine, and the shape of that absence had been hurting for 3 decades. Whatever happens next, the money, the name, the resources, those are tools. Use them or don't. But the reason I'm sitting here has nothing to do with any of that. It's because my daughter stopped her car for a stranger. That's the inheritance that matters, not the estate." Marlene reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was dry and warm, and his grip was steady, and she held on to it the way you hold on to evidence that the world is not entirely made of sharp edges and locked doors. That night she sat on the back porch of the townhouse with Ethan. The air smelled like the neighbor's honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass, and the particular sweetness of a late spring evening when the day's heat is fading but the warmth remains. He sat beside her on the steps, close, touching, his shoulder against hers, not tentatively, not as a question, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd decided where he belonged and had stopped asking permission to be there. "I talked to my mother today," Ethan said. "Set the boundary." "What did you say?" "That I love her, that she's my mother and nothing changes that, but that if she ever treats you the way she has been, even once, even a look, even a tone, she loses me, not temporarily, permanently." Marlene looked at him. In the porch light, his face was half shadowed, half lit, and she could see both versions of him at once, the man who'd failed her and the man who was trying to become someone who wouldn't. Neither version was a lie. People weren't single things. They were the distance between who they'd been and who they were becoming, and the measure of a person was whether that distance was closing or widening. For Ethan, for the first time in 3 years, it was closing. How did she take it? She cried. Vivian cried. For about 10 seconds. Then she straightened up and said she understood. And I think, for the first time in my life, I think she actually did. Marlene leaned into him. He put his arm around her. They sat like that for a long time, watching the last light drain out of the sky and the first stars appear in the spaces between. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago. The woman who'd smiled through contempt because she didn't know what else to do. The woman who'd confused endurance with strength, who'd believed that if she was patient enough and kind enough, the people hurting her would eventually stop. That woman wasn't gone. She was still in there, and the kindness that defined her was still the most valuable thing she possessed. But she'd been joined by something else. Something forged in the space between being told you're not enough and discovering that you always were. Not hardness, not cruelty turned outward instead of inward, just clarity. The ability to see herself without needing someone else's approval to confirm what she saw. The thing about being broken open by people who underestimate you is that it forces you to find out what you're made of at a depth you never would have reached on your own. Nobody digs that deep voluntarily. Nobody dismantles their own foundations just to see what's underneath. It takes someone like Vivian, someone who strips you down to nothing because they think nothing is all you are, to push you into the territory where you discover that the nothing they see is actually everything that matters. Marlene had learned something in the past 3 years that no amount of comfort could have taught her. She'd learned that dignity doesn't come from being treated with dignity. It comes from maintaining your own regardless of how you're treated. She'd learned that the people who hurt you the most are usually the people who are most afraid of what you represent. And she'd learned that forgiveness is not a gift you give to the person who wronged you. It's a weight you set down so your hands are free to build something better. The library opened its mobile unit program 4 months later. 3 retrofitted vans carrying books into every underserved corner of the county, staffed by volunteers Marlene had recruited from the community and funded by a grant that Leonard's foundation supported but did not control. The distinction mattered to her. She didn't want his empire's name on the vans. She wanted the library's name, because the library was hers. It had been hers before she knew who her father was, before the Caldwell name entered her life, before any of the external markers that the world used to assign value had attached themselves to her story. The library was proof that she'd been building something valuable all along, with nothing but competence and care, and she refused to let anyone, including Leonard, retroactively explain that value through the lens of his wealth. Leonard understood. He'd spent 31 years learning the difference between what money can do and what it can't, and the thing it could never do, the thing no amount of zeros on a balance sheet could purchase, was the kind of worth that comes from being a person who stops their car in the rain. That couldn't be bought, only built. And his daughter had been building it her whole life without knowing she'd inherited the blueprint from a mother she'd never met and a father she'd found by accident on a road that led nowhere. Marlene stood in the parking lot on opening day and watched the first van pull out. Ethan stood beside her. Leonard stood behind them. Vivian, who had written a personal check for the volunteer training program and delivered it to the library in person, without fanfare, without an audience, without any of the theatrical generosity she'd practiced for decades, was somewhere inside helping Janet organize the back office with a competence that surprised everyone except Marlene, who had come to understand that Vivian Caldwell's real tragedy had never been a lack of capability. It had been the misdirection of it. All that intelligence, all that force of will, all that relentless energy, spent for years on the project of controlling everyone around her, when it could have been spent on something that actually mattered. The van turned the corner and disappeared. Marlene watched it go. She felt the spring sun on her face and Ethan's hand in hers, and the solid, quiet presence of a father she was still learning to know standing close enough to touch. None of them were fixed. None of them were finished. Ethan was still learning how to be brave. Vivian was still learning how to be kind. Leonard was still learning how to be a father. And Marlene was still learning how to hold all of it, the anger she'd earned and the forgiveness she'd chosen, and the identity that kept expanding every time she thought she'd found its edges. But they were all, in their own way, trying. And the trying, the daily unglamorous commitment to becoming slightly better than you were yesterday, was the only thing that had ever mattered. Not the money, not the name, not the revelation that rearranged a ballroom, just the quiet, stubborn, fundamentally human refusal to let the worst things that happened to you become the truest things about you. Marlene Hayes, librarian, daughter, wife, a woman who stopped her car in the rain. And that was enough. It had always been enough. The rest of the world just needed time to catch up.